Hello everyone and welcome back for this video where I'm finally going to finish off the matched pair army for my 15mm Athenians featured in a previous video. These, just like the Athenians, are an Essex miniatures full army list pre-packed at the factory and came to me all at once with the Athenians. I had intended to complete the two back-to-back, but between being a little burned out from painting that many miniatures at the time and life and some other work engagements getting in the way, it's taken me a little while, but finally I'm here and I hope you enjoy coming with me on this little adventure to paint up this many little Spartan men. I'm going to take you through the full process, starting with cleaning and preparing my miniatures. So I have, at this point, cleaned in warm soapy water all of the miniatures and laid them out on a towel. Laying them out like this for this many miniatures is pretty essential in order to get a good inventory of what you have and how they're going to be organized when you glue them to their bases. For the bases, I'm using 3D printed bases that I made at home. You could probably use cardstock or something as well. But these 3D printed ones are thick and stick nicely to my painting grips. In order to texture the bases, I use a mixture of baking soda and cat litter, actually. The cat litter makes sort of pebbles and rocks, whereas the baking soda makes a sandy surface. And also helps the super glue, the cyanoacrylate glue, basically any that you want, but I use gel because it's thicker, to bond up and firm quicker and actually hold onto the miniatures, since, as you'll probably find out, standing them up can be a little difficult. So I try to stand them as best they can on their own balance, placing them into whatever formation I like, and then I grab them and sprinkle over some cat litter just to make some rocks and ruggedness to the terrain around them. The last thing I add to the bases is the baking soda itself, because that sort of seals everything else in and helps the super glue bind up. It acts as a catalyst, so the super glue dries and turns into this sort of rubbery, hard paste. Finally, you'd have to get the spears onto these guys, and that is by far the most frustrating part. I'm using tweezers and trying to be really accurate. You'll see what I do is I try to put a little bit of super glue on the hands of the miniatures, and then I dip the spear into the baking soda, so there's just a fine amount of baking soda that'll hopefully help it dry up and set. And then I hold them in place very lightly with tweezers in my finger, just trying to get them settled on top, and they all fall off. So keep doing that over and over again. Eventually the super glue will get sticky enough that it'll hold on and just tack on, and the spears can settle into place. I have no better suggestions than that, to be honest. That was the worst part of this entire project, was trying to get those guys to sit. Having gel super glue will at least mean that the super glue should tack up a little faster and hold them on. So if for nothing else, I recommend you get gel super glue for that. After that, I grab my black Vallejo primer and I apply it through my airbrush to all of the miniatures. I normally say, you can go a little bit either way with the primer, but if you're going to use black Vallejo primer, in this case in particular, I wouldn't recommend doing it with a traditional brush, just because I found it injects bubbles and it's hard to get a thin coat. And with miniatures this small, having a thin coat of primer is essential if you want to keep the detail. After that, I grabbed a little bit of white acrylic ink and applied that from above, creating what's called a zenithal highlight. So it's a highlight from the zenith directly above the miniatures, which is just going to help make everything there's a little bit of cheap shading, basically. So with these really small miniatures, I can get some cheap detail on them by just making this fake lighting underneath. Since I paint everything with inks in order to work up in thin coats and show through the base, the primer here a little bit, this should show through and it should help darken the lower areas and lighten the raised areas and just save a little bit of the fine detail work that my hands might be a little too shaky for anyway. It'll also mean that if there are areas that are missed while I'm painting this many miniatures all at once, they are going to be either black or gray and underneath something, so they're not going to be super noticeable and they'll probably just look shaded anyway. Now with those tips and tricks out of the way, I'm going to move on to actually applying my first real ink color, my base colors to this, and that's going to be my brown ink. Brown goes almost everywhere on these guys. I use it as a base for skin, I use it for spears, I also use it on the ground underneath them. If you saw my Athenians video, you'll see I did much the same thing in terms of color choices. Here I got some brown onto the horse by accident while I was going in for the arms, and I realized, he's going to have a brown horse. So I'm just kind of trying to work with my mistakes there as I can. And honestly, having slightly more varied horses for the cavalry is not that much of a mistake anyway. I didn't do any in-depth research to find out what kind of horses the Spartans should have been riding, since I'm giving them a Hollywood red coloring overall, like uniform anyway. That being said, these guys are supposed to be skirmishers, they're helots, they're slaves for the Spartans, so I'm painting them all in brown. They're going to be very drab. They don't get the red clothes of the sworn warriors, you know, the alpha males of the Spartan society or what have you. They're going to be just in whatever jute or fabric clothing they have as slaves. Finally, as I mentioned, I'm going to use it for the bases. This brown ink will soak into all the crevices, but you'll find probably the baking soda surface absorbs a lot more ink than you think it otherwise would. So make sure you've got a lot of ink ready, and use a biggish brush so it can carry a lot of ink to the bases. The other thing I'm going to try and pay attention to do here is not paint over as much of the cat litter as possible. It's going to stay gray from the priming and just look like pebbles and such, and add some detail and definition to the bases after we flock them, just for, you know, a little more aesthetic. I'm going to go on with the red ink next. My red ink looks a little pink and it's a little thin, but I'm going to apply it everywhere I'd want the red, and it's going to be the base color sort of in the shadows. We're going to come back later and we're going to highlight both the red and brown areas in order to pull them out and make them pop. Just add a little bit of saturation to them so they're nice and flashy. Try to be careful now as you add your red color on top of everything else. You want to keep it away as much as possible from the white areas, the brown areas, that kind of stuff, because it's really going to stand out on them. That being said, if you do make any mistakes, we're about to start highlighting everything, so you should be able to cover it up then. I'm no stranger to mistakes, as you can see from how it's flowing everywhere as I try to do this horse's bridle precisely. We're going on now with the highlights to the brown areas. For this, I'm using a brown that is just a little bit of brown ink, some yellow ink, and some white acrylic paint to thicken it up a little bit. You want to use the acrylic paint to thicken it up because that'll help you be more precise when you apply it. And in this case, being precise is kind of important. We're trying to keep this just to the raised edges, which hopefully should be easy to find at this point. By having the zenithal highlight underneath and then the ink which flows away from raised edges, you should find the raised areas are just a little desaturated. They're going to be a little grayer, a little browner, or a little more transparent. And those are the areas you want to be touching up with this illuminated color anyway, because the recesses, where everything's dark and settled, well, they're the shaded areas, so they shouldn't be highlighted. This is just a little trick I found like in the workflow. It helps me locate the right areas, get through all this quickly, and just slap on some color. And slapping on this extra color is super important when we're working at this scale. We're not going to be doing a lot of detail. I'm sure there's people who can go into crazy detail, who could paint the eyes on these guys or something like that. But frankly, I would almost say it's not necessary. Easy for me to say, I don't do it. But it certainly seems like at this scale, once you put on more and more detail, it all muddies together. So instead, you want to stick to big, broad shapes that communicate your army. Unless you're using them as display pieces, I guess. But if you're going to have 12 units on the table, as is the case for DBA, you really don't need or want to be looking at each of them individually really up close most of the time. You need them to be clearly visible and attractive from a distance. So we're doing the red here as well. Red is kind of weird to highlight. I wouldn't recommend lighting it or lightening it with white because it's going to desaturate and turn kind of pink. But if you do want to lighten your paint because you don't have a lighter red already available pre-mixed, using a little bit of yellow can do that for you. It'll turn it a little more crimson, almost orangey, but you want to just put not quite so much yellow that it turns orange looking. And that'll lighten it without making it look desaturated and sad. It should still look like red, especially when you apply it over top of other red, as we're doing here over top of the red ink wash. Next, we're going to go in with the faces, and again, this is a question of making the details communicate and pop without being too detailed. I'm just going to grab a mixture of brown, yellow, red, and white, and go in over the nose, the brow, the cheeks, the chin, just the very raised most edges of any face. And then, of course, the skin as well. Try to pick out individual fingers if possible, or individual muscles where they're raised up thanks to the sculptor here. And those, by leaving some brown areas in between, some ink areas that you haven't touched at all, that should give some definition and communicate a face at a long distance. So, you know, at the over the tabletop. If you were to try and go in and be really subtle and make, you know, a pinkish cheeks, rosy cheeks, and then pink lips, and paint the eyes in and all that kind of stuff, what you'd probably get is just sort of a pinkish mess, a blob of a face that doesn't communicate face. Whereas by leaving these areas bare, hopefully you can see it in the video, as you pull away from them, you can see the shape of the face communicated, even at 3-foot distance. Going in with black ink now, I'm going to do the hair and beards of most of the miniatures in black, just because that's a pretty common hair color for that area, and it's easier that way. And the Spartans are supposed to be somewhat standardized, professional looking. I'm doing air quotes, but you can't see them right now. They were renowned for being the professional army of Greece at the time. So being standardized isn't a problem. I'm also going to do the 2 flanking horses in black, so the center guy's got a brown horse. Just separating the 2 horses of different colors, I guess. It looks a little more meaningful that way, or a little more distinct. Going in after this, I'm going to start just refining the white areas. This is again a highlighting layer, going in with a white acrylic paint. I want to make sure that whatever is supposed to be white is kind of bright white, especially the bridles on these horses where my black ink has really run everywhere. This is another case where using acrylic paint instead of using ink will serve you kind of well, because the thickness of it will mean you can be a little more precise. You also, again, only want to pick out the most raised edges. On the skirts here, a good example is I'm just putting a little dot of white on the tips of the white areas here, which are gray thanks to our primer, so that kind of saved us some work. And that's just going to make everything sort of pop a little bit more. It's going to make it look like there's a lot of texture in their armor where there isn't necessarily that much sculpted on or even painted on. It's just sort of taps with a very fine paintbrush. The other areas that I'm going to use are areas on the linothorax, which is sort of the body armor of the Spartans, particularly their shoulder pads I want to leave white. And also the flag, which I added a sort of red chevron to, the symbol of Sparta. And I'm going to paint in the raised areas around the chevron in white again, and sort of fade it out by just feathering it, so very, very lightly touching it with my brush and dragging away quickly in order to sort of fade it in with the gray and the black as much as possible. The same effect with the skirts I can do to pretty much any important character, but I'm going to find if you've packed your hoplites 4 to a base side by each like I did, you're going to find that for the hoplite units it may not be practical to get in and do everybody's skirt. Fortunately, the guys in the middle of the phalanx, at least as far as I'm concerned, aren't all that visible, and so they're not that easy to get to, but they also aren't that noticeable if I didn't add the white dots to all of their skirts. I also left one of my auxilia, white sort of tunic, so I'm just going to touch the edges of that and do the same highlighting deal. The fletching on the arrows is the final bit of white highlighting, and hopefully this white, between the white and the red, these sort of vibrant colors should make your army start to pop a little bit more, and you, like me, might get a little excited finally seeing it, because if you're following along one-to-one with this, you know as well as I do that this is a lot of work. This is a lot of little miniatures to be doing back to back to back to back. So finally we're going on with the flocking. The flocking finally adds some green. My mixture of flock that I use is a bit of static grass from Woodland Scenics, with also some dill, oregano, and a little bit of maybe some flocking clumps or whatever. I just mixed a whole bunch of stuff to make it look sort of disparate and dynamic, and have a whole lot of colors going on in there, and just mix it up. So I use matte Mod Podge. You could use any white glue really for this. The other attributes of Mod Podge as a sealer primer aren't that useful right now, but I just apply my white glue around the base, all around the miniatures, try not to get it on the miniatures so flock doesn't stick to them, and then tap on some flock. Just grab it in a pinch, tap it on, then tap it off into the cup like that. By adding your flocking on sort of in a big bundled pinch, hopefully the ends of the flock should be what's sticking into the glue, and that should mean that your flock is standing up, at least most of it anyway. And so you're going to get a sort of actually grassy look instead of everything laying flat and sad on its side. The flock is also probably going to stick off the edge of the bases, and if any stuck to your characters, this is also a great time to be correcting that. So grabbing a hobby knife, you can just sort of scrape along the edges of the base. And doing it now rather than doing it later just saves you the trouble, because we're about to varnish the miniatures, and once it's varnished, the static grass gets even harder to remove. Although you can see there's a little bit of glue overhang and stuff like that. It's going to be a problem. Any pieces that you want to keep on but seem fragile, you can just tap them back into place, and then hopefully the varnish will add another layer over top and hold them in place, for the foreseeable future. Scraping off the edges here, you can see I've got some pretty defined edges on my 3D printed bases. They got that sort of ribbing from the layers. When we paint the edges, it'll cover it up a little bit, and also en masse, the detail, I don't notice it too much. I'm going to use a matte varnish. This is a Liquitex matte varnish from Michael's, my local hobby store. It works pretty well out of an airbrush, just straight as is, which is perfect, so I just fire it on with an airbrush. Again, having thin coats in this case is pretty important. There's a lot of tiny nooks and crannies where you could collect varnish, and varnish, if it's applied too thickly, gets a sort of sheeny, purple, foggy texture almost, and it doesn't look great. So you're going to want to avoid that if possible. A light application through an airbrush is the ideal. That being said, you could probably do it with a brush as well, or maybe you have a varnish that works better for you. Or you could use rattle cans, like the shaky cans of varnish. If you have those, they would probably work just fine too. Now that we've gotten to the end of the varnishing, we just need to do the metallic areas. Now I've saved the metals to the end after the varnishing because using a matte varnish would make the metals matte, which would mean they wouldn't be shiny, which would mean they wouldn't look metallic. So I needed to wait until the end. Unfortunately, what that does mean is this is the time where, of all of the times in this entire process, unfortunately, this is the one where I'm going to have to say, like, try and be as accurate as you can. And I hate that. I like being able to just correct my mistakes on the fly, but metallic paint, the little flakes of metal, are really, really hard to get off, especially once you get it onto a varnished or finished surface, but pretty much any surface. They're so hard to get clear. And if you paint back over top, you'll find that you're going to be painting on the new ink, and the new ink is not going to look matte like the rest of the miniature. A quick solution for that, though, if you do get into that, is to mix your ink with just a little bit of the matte Mod Podge. So if it's just a small area you need to touch up, you can cover it up with that mixture of the matte Mod Podge and the ink, and the Mod Podge should help the ink dry a little more matte than it would otherwise. So that can help you get away with kind of tiny mistakes with the metals, which is, you got to have some way to catch up on that. The big thing here that you're going to notice if you're into, ancient Greeks or whatever, is I'm not putting designs on the shields. And this is for the same reason as with my Athenians. I'm not that into freehand. I don't think I could do it to that many shields to any standard that I would like. And B, there's just so many of them, and this is such a huge project. I'm just going to back off for a second here. Hopefully I can get some decals or maybe print out some shield, symbology to put on them. But as it is, I'm just going to stick with what I've got there. Don't forget to do the greaves on your hoplites. I actually came back and did them again later because I had forgotten, since they're just so low. But they do have greaves sculpted on if you're using the same miniatures, and so you're going to want to have the greaves painted in bronze. To explain my choices of colors, I've used the bronze for all of the armor bits, and I'm going to use silver paint for all of the weapon bits. The weapons being presumably made of iron, a stronger material for that purpose, and all of the other items being made of bronze, as was the case in the historical record, as far as I could tell anyway. Going in with this silver, you're going to find it's really, really shiny, but I'm going to wash all of my metals with a mixture of, I'd say, 80% water, a little bit of airbrush flow improver by Vallejo, in order to reduce the surface tension of it a little bit, and some black and brown ink. The black and brown ink mean that instead of it just being a flat black, it's going to be a little warm, thanks to the brown. So you should get a nicer look to it than just black sitting in the recesses. And by putting this over top of all your metal areas, you're going to pull down that shine a little bit. Because the shine of the metallic paints at this scale is a little too shiny, almost. You're going to get pretty big reflections. Whereas if you could just pull it down a little bit with this wash, and you can just shade the recesses of it, you're going to give it a lot more definition. It's not going to look as flat on the miniatures. On the shields, you're going to want to be particularly careful, though, because they are round surfaces, so they don't have a nice nook for the ink to settle into. So if you don't clean them up as you go, the ink is going to gather at the bottom and make sort of a weird dark spot. So you have your paintbrush ready to wick away any of the wash that you need to wick away. I'm sure there's commercial washes that would do this as well, if not better, but I'm just using the wash I have because it's the wash I made. So it's the same wash I used in the HMCS Sackville build done a few weeks ago, if you'd like to look at that. Yeah, you'll see also on the spearheads, it's gathering sort of in the middle. That's just, thank goodness, however it's sculpted or however they're sitting, the surface tension of my wash is just perfect. So it makes a little bit of a recess, like there's a little bit of a fuller in the spear blades. So that's nice. Finally, I grabbed some Flow acrylic, which is like a very thin acrylic paint, and it's black, evidently, and just put that around the edges. Using Flow acrylic instead of normal acrylic means it doesn't keep brush strokes as much, and it sort of settles down really smooth around the edges of bases, so that's my preferred paint for it, doing the edges of all my miniatures bases. You could, of course, if you were doing this project, choose anything you want, brown, or go for like an old Games Workshop green or something, but I use black because my miniatures stand up from the tabletop anyway, so I kind of prefer to embrace the almost diorama look of having them on entirely separate bases, basically, with the black outline. So that's it. I'm finally finished my Spartan army. Now I have a Spartan army and an Athenian army, both suited for DBA 3.0, De Bellis Antiquitatis. It's a pretty cool rule set. It plays really fast. I enjoy it quite a lot for historical stuff because you can just sort of lay it out and play a game in actually literally half an hour. Not one of those like, it'll only take you half an hour to play, but then you got a half hour setup on either end, stuff like that. DBA is actually a really, really simple rule set. If you'd like to see some battle reports or like some rules reviews for that, I'd be happy to put those up. I've got my sort of table set up for gaming now. So let me know in the comments. If you have any questions about what you saw or any comments on what you saw, anything you'd like to say, anything you'd like to request, feel free to throw those in the comments as well. I love to see that kind of stuff. I'm really happy I was able to get back and put this video up and do a little bit more work on these Spartans. And I hope you enjoyed it as well. So thank you all very much for watching. I hope you'll come back and watch some more videos on this channel in the future as well. I've got some decent plans for where things could go if all goes well at my end. And I hope you'll be along for the ride. Thank you again, and go play some games.